Okay, everyone. As I said, my name is Christine Cruz. I am a lead meteorologist here at the National Weather Service in Salt Lake City. And Kevin Huyck has so kindly offered to do this presentation for us. He's also a meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Duluth, Minnesota. And Kevin, if you want to go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation, Christine, and the introduction. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here and speaking to everyone today about a topic that's pretty close to me personally, and I think affects far more people in the weather service specifically, but in meteorology in general more than maybe typically known. We originally worked on this presentation for the NWA annual meeting last August, and my co-author is Matthew Bolton. He's studies psychology and at the College of Arts and Sciences in St. Leo University, and is working on his certification in social work right now. So he's unfortunately unable to join us this evening, but he's been my backstop and provided a lot of really good additional content and some background beyond what I was able to comprehend, because I'm approaching this from a science and life experience kind of standpoint. So he's really added a lot to this presentation. I appreciate his participation in building it. So we're going to be talking a little bit about team building in the meteorological workplace with people on the autism spectrum. Both Matt and I are autistic. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 35 years old, which was quite a revelation to me. It finally answered a bunch of questions that I'd been asking myself throughout most of my life about how I'm able to the difficulties I have with social interaction and other types of things like that. I also have ADHD, and there's about 61% of people with autism also have ADHD. So I'm one of those as well. So a couple of different mental health challenges that I face on a pretty regular basis. So I started talking about this topic about 3 years ago, and have trying to build awareness and acceptance amongst folks in our field. So this is Archie. Archie is going to help me explain a few of these concepts. Archie was a cartoon that was developed by Rebecca Burgess to help explain some slightly complicated autism spectrum things a couple of years ago. And I've been using him in my presentations for a couple of years now to help explain some of these ideas. So what is the autism spectrum, and what is the autism spectrum condition more broadly? Well, by definition, it's a neurological difference which causes social communication and behavioral challenges. And we talk about it being a spectrum, but it's not the spectrum that we might be thinking of that's a linear spectrum with a slider from more to less, but it's more like a wheel, as Archie is showing here in the image on the right-hand side. And there are different ways to draw this wheel. This one has 5 axes. I've seen as many as 10 in some cases. But the general sense here is that along each one of these axes, you have more ability and less ability. And so each individual person lands at different points on each one of these axes. And so when we talk about autism spectrum and how it's expressed by individuals, there's a lot of variability. So much so that you can't generalize autism amongst a group of people. If you've met one person who is autistic, then you've met one person. Those experiences can't be effectively generalized to a larger population. And this is part of the reason why. A recent study from 2020 estimated that around 1 in 45 adults in the United States have autism spectrum condition. We like to use the word condition more than the condition as more of an accepting term that we like to use when we're discussing this. So you'll see me use autism spectrum condition through the rest of this presentation, interchangeably with ASD. But around 1 in 45 adults in the United States. Autistic individuals tend to be stronger in systemizing tasks as opposed to empathizing tasks. And so what do we mean by that? Sympathizing means this orientation toward attention to details, following rules, creating and following instructions. And the empathizing side has two different branches that you go down. One is the cognitive branch of empathizing, which is understanding another person's mental state and ability to infer what they might be thinking based on how they're acting and what they're saying. And then there's the affective, which is picking up on the affect of another individual, emotionally responding to mental states, either one's own mental state or another person's mental state as they're expressing it. So the systemizers tend to focus on STEM fields for their careers, including meteorology and the atmospheric sciences. So why is that? Well, science fields tend to have a lot of systemizing and not so much of the empathizing component. We sit down and go through calculus and differential equations and thermodynamics and dynamic meteorology and all these other things. There's not a lot of empathizing in those. Those are all learning rules and operations and how things interact, how the atmosphere interacts with itself and with the earth and the sun. And so they tend to attract people who have these stronger tendencies toward systemizing. Systemizers tend to be detail-oriented, conscientious in their work. Means they take a high degree of pride in the work that they're doing, and especially the detail in that work. And they seem to possess an innate ability to find patterns and anomalies in data. And part of that speaks to how the systemizer's mind works. It's looking for things that it's seen before. And so it's able to pick out signal out of sometimes noisy data. And one of the examples of this is in radar or satellite meteorology, where you have noisy data fields, and these systemizers would likely be able to pick out signal a little bit easier than somebody that is more on the neurotypical side of the mental health spectrum. Another study from 2020 suggests that the autism community has a greater attention to and interest in weather specifically than the non-autistic population. And perhaps this is an underutilized reservoir of meteorological talent, both from the observing and volunteering side of things, but also from the practical application, forecasting, research, and those types of activities as well. So shifting our focus a little bit to autism in the workplace. Again, we're repeating the STEM career groups. A study from Rusick and others in 2015 found that as they did a study of about 500,000 participants, that their autism quotient score, which is a 50-question tool that's used to determine the tendency for an individual to be on the autism spectrum versus not. They found that over this 500,000 people study, they could infer the likelihood that an individual participant would be in a STEM field based on where their score fell on the autism quotient test. And so, that's more reinforcing research to show that people with autism spectrum tend to focus on these STEM fields. Technical companies and banking companies also have caught on to this, and there have been several large companies that have active recruiting targeting people on the autism spectrum for this ability to systemize and follow rules and find signals in messy data. And so they've recognized that this is a strength. And I think it's a strength for us in meteorology and atmospheric sciences as well, especially from the operational side. The ability to look through complicated data sets and quickly arrive at decisions is a strength that is particularly important in our work. So with the estimation of the prevalence of autism spectrum condition in the general population and this preference towards STEM fields, including meteorology and atmospheric sciences, we can assume that for, a National Weather Service office that has 18 meteorologists on staff likely has at least one person and likely several more that are on the autism spectrum. So each of us that works in operational meteorology likely works with or has worked with an autistic person during our career. So again, there was another study from 2012 where the researchers took two groups of people, one group that was known to be autistic and another group that was not autistic, and they put them through a visual recognition kind of test where you'd sit down in a room with a computer screen in front of you, and they would flash alternating blank screens and screens with symbols on them. And the symbols would have a mix of, a mix of both signal and also noisy characters. And they would want you to focus on finding and counting how many of the signal characters there were amongst all the noisy characters. Then they would show you a blank screen again for a period of time. And then they would show you a question mark, and you had to try to remember not only how many signal characters you saw earlier, but where on the screen the question mark was. And they discovered that the people who had autism spectrum were able to be successful in this test with a higher number of noise characters than their non-autistic counterparts. So again, proving this idea that they have this higher perceptual capacity, especially when it comes to visual information. The other trick and difficulty that autism spectrum presents is this higher perceptual capacity can also lead to distraction. And that comes from some challenges with processing incoming sensory information. So when we're focused on a task, like visual, looking at model data represented on a computer screen, radar data, satellite, those sorts of things. If we can focus our attention, we can do really well picking out signal from noise in those environments. But at the same time, that higher perception means that we hear more sounds, more noise in the work environment, from the air conditioning to the hum of the computer screens, hum of fluorescent lights, fans that may be running on computers, all sorts of little things. For me personally, I have, tactile sensory processing challenges. And so for me, it's, sometimes when I'm sweating, that's something that my brain has to try to cope with, the sensation of having the sweat on my body. Excuse me. And also the feeling of my clothes on my skin, the feeling of the air temperature. Is it warm? Is it cool? Those sorts of things. And what I've found is that, one of my autistic traits is that I rock when I'm sitting, usually back and forth, but sometimes side to side if I'm in a stationary chair. And what I found is that rocking motion helps me to ignore these tactile sensory inputs so that I'm not using part of my mental capacity to deal with those inputs. I can ignore them at that point. Sometimes I feel that if I really need to focus, I need to have headphones on. And sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm listening to music, and sometimes I'm listening to white noise, because the white noise helps cancel out all the other distracting sounds I might hear. But with all this taken together, it seems as though people on the autism spectrum tend to perform well with tasks that require visual processing. So what's the other trick, or challenge that we have when we're dealing with autism in the workplace? And that comes down to this double empathy problem. So double empathy problem deals with an ability for two people to be able to communicate with each other and understand the intent of the communication and the meaning of not only the words, but the body language. So an autistic person here on the left may struggle to read in between the lines. And I'm sure that, when I mention that, everybody has some experience where they were, told something or read something as communication, and that wasn't the whole meaning. There's a little bit that had to be interpreted or inferred. And autistic people tend to have a little bit of a problem trying to figure out what else is meant beyond what is actually written or said. That's that reading between the lines part. The non-autistic person, on the other hand, thinks that they're communicating well because other non-autistic people that they communicate with can interpret and read in between the lines and see the meaning behind the meaning. And so they may start to form a negative impression of the autistic person because the autistic person just isn't quite getting it. Meanwhile, the autistic person has to work to try to overcome these misconceptions about autism and ability and intentionality in some cases to be understood correctly. For me, personally, I've been told that I'm too direct in my communication and I can come off as intimidating and brusque, and people may not like the way I communicate. And it's difficult for me to add a little bit more softness in my tone, to be a little bit more concealed in my meaning, to have that set up that situation where people would need to read between the lines. If I want somebody to know something I'm thinking, I come right out and say it. And that may be off-putting to some people. The autistic person may also struggle to manage those sensory distractions that I discussed on the previous slide. Meanwhile, the non-autistic person may imagine sensory difficulties that don't exist for the individual or individuals that they're working with. And so through all of this mismatch, both parties struggle to understand the thoughts and feelings, behaviors, intent of the other person, and that can set up conflict. So how do we overcome these challenges to build stronger teams? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can start with this. The first is simply being aware of what autism is and how it can affect people, and realizing that there's not one cutout template for how autistic people behave. You have to get to know the person themselves. Here's Archie again. Sometimes if a person is diagnosed as being on the spectrum and informs someone else, it's so that they can get to some kind of understanding and respect for the things they are unable to do. But it is also so that they can cooperate with the world around them and they can be the best at the things they can do. It's helpful to remember that on every team, each team member has strengths and weaknesses. And the best teams have people who complement each other's strengths and weaknesses to help build a more effective community. And so these challenges that an autistic person may face also comes with a lot of benefits. And so if we can work past the communication challenges and the intentionality and a little bit of this empathy problem, autistic people can be a terrific resource to operational forecast teams, research teams, and just general in the workplace. Now, for somebody to be able to come out and say that they're on the autism spectrum, or to be able to talk about their challenges, there has to be a little bit of an open and welcoming workplace environment for somebody to feel comfortable discussing this with their colleagues. And so this double empathy problem comes into play here again as well, because if an autistic person isn't able to have a good working relationship with another individual, they may not feel comfortable discussing their experiences and their challenges and also their skills. And so there needs to be a little bit of trust and a little bit of openness. And that can be particularly hard for someone on the autism spectrum, because over the course of their lives, they've probably encountered these situations dealing with people who think that they're less than, or that they're unable to do a particular task or tasks. And so there may be some initial distrust before they even get into the organization. But dealing with other people once they're in the organization can also set up that kind of distrust. But even so, it can be very helpful for a person on the autism spectrum to be forthcoming with their communication preferences and difficulties, and also their skill sets. And both parties across the entire workplace need to accept that misinterpretation happens, and to assume that our colleagues have the best intent in mind at all times, unless we can prove conclusively that they have some ulterior motive. But I don't think it's a particularly healthy mindset to be in, to be thinking that our colleagues have anything less than the best intentions when we're interacting with each other. So if we can accept that misinterpretation happens, we can help build bridges between the individuals on our teams and in our workplaces to overcome some of these communication challenges. There can be accommodations to help individuals in our organizations learn the communications ins and outs, and this includes cultural norms. Now, to be perfectly honest, cultural norms wasn't a thing I had considered personally until about 2018, year 2018. That's the first time I had heard of this cultural norms. In my work career, you get handed an employee handbook or a set of rules that everyone's expected to follow. And I interpreted that as the period rules period. And so I would have difficulty when I notice coworkers are not following the stuff that's written down. And it didn't occur to me that there's this cultural norms that's also in play, where there's a little bit of adaptation to what's written down. And you can't account for every situation in a handbook or a policy guide. There has to be some flexibility, and that's where these cultural norms come in. And it can be difficult for a person on the autism spectrum to pick up on those cultural norms through their day-to-day experiences. But yet they're not written down anywhere. There's no helpful guide to consult necessarily. It has to be learned by experience. So this is also a situation where supervisors and leaders and mentors can also benefit from additional training for how to work with diverse teams, including diverse neurotypes. Diversity is a broad category. It's far more than just race and gender and physical ability. We need to also include neurodiversity when we're thinking about diversity in our workplaces. There are a number of different skill sets and abilities and strengths that we can incorporate and include if we seek to make sure that we are searching out these individuals and also doing our best day to day individually to make sure that they're included and welcomed and part of the team. And so Archie has a final thought here. He says that I hope that in the future, people will better understand the term spectrum in autism spectrum condition and respect the differences and similarities we all share in how we experience the world. So this is what I've have for my presentation. I intended to leave quite a bit of time for questions, and so I think we're at that point. And I'll turn it back over to Christine here.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This was a great presentation. I learned quite a bit from it. I have a question just to start off. So what would your suggestion be if you have a coworker or somebody even outside of work who you see characteristics that may suggest that they're on the autism spectrum, but they're not comfortable sharing that. So it's not something where you can go and ask them if they're on the spectrum. I don't think that's appropriate. So what is the best way to try to develop those communication skills with somebody who doesn't feel comfortable sharing that they're on the spectrum?
That's a really great question, Christine. Thank you for that one. This is a question that I'm presented with, on a probably the question I get the most often out of all the discussions I've heard. And you're right. It's not necessarily appropriate to go up to somebody and say, "Well, are you on the autism spectrum?" I mean, just the same way that you wouldn't go up to somebody and ask, any of the other personal questions that we know to stay away from in the workplace. I think the best course of action in those situations is to try to work on the mindfulness aspect that I mentioned a few slides back, trying to be mindful of the intentionality and realize that for most people, they have the best intentions in the workplace. And basically you have to build a level of comfort with that person. And try to, there aren't any really simple answers to this. It's a very challenging question. But just being able to work with them, encourage them, include them, and make them feel as though they are part of, an important part of the group is probably the best thing you can do to try to encourage people to develop that level of comfort. But some autistic people may never be comfortable expressing or sharing with them those personal details for a vast number of reasons. And so the other thing that I would suggest is that if you suspect that someone may be on the autism spectrum, just try to work with them in that way and realize that they may be direct. They may be saying exactly what they think. They're not necessarily holding anything back in their communication, and they don't mean ill will if they're stepping on somebody's feet or being direct or pointing out a thought or opinion that they have. They may not have those cultural niceties that help soften that communication. And if you can look past that and see the intent, I think that probably helps a lot.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a great answer. And I actually have one follow-up question, if you don't mind. So something that I deal with, I'm not on the autism spectrum, but I do have sensory issues. And you've talked a bit about sensory issues. And so my question was somewhat about I'm trying to think about how to phrase it, but how to accommodate those sensory issues if you notice somebody is having, I don't know, I'm not phrasing it very well, but how to best handle sensory issues if it's something that's a little bit more unusual that you're noticing, I guess, in some ways is what I'm asking because I know my sensory issues are related to sound and repetitive sounds, intrusive sounds. I lose all of my concentration. So I know how to remedy it for myself, but if I'm supervising people that are having sensory issues, is there a better way to accommodate that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
This one's a little bit tricky as well. I mean, as part of the National Weather Service, there really aren't, when we talk about accommodations in the National Weather Service, we're talking about usually like physical or visual things, like a person who has color blindness, being able to access color tables for imagery that are usable for that for that challenge. Somebody who has difficulty hearing may be having access to some kind of hearing compensation so that they can hear what's being discussed and participate that way. But as far as the sensory, the cognitive sensory issues, there isn't very much that's written down, if you will, as far as what the rules are. And so in this way, it again comes down a little bit to self-advocacy. If a person, like for myself, I rock when I'm at work. I went out and picked up small fans, the little desk fans that you might see at Target or Walmart. And I have a desk fan at each one of our workstations so that if I happen to be working at that workstation, I can turn on a fan and keep myself cool, because I don't know about anybody else's office, but the temperature and humidity in our operations area seems to fluctuate wildly across the day, based on circumstance I'm not familiar with. And so just having that accommodation of being able to use the fan to keep myself cool and comfortable is a big help. And then just being able to rock. We also have dimmable lights in our operations area. And so whenever I'm working, I ask if we can keep the lights a little bit lower. That helps me out quite a bit. But we also have people who want brighter light, especially on mid shifts or evening shifts, to try to compensate for the sleep challenges and things. And so there are times when, if I'm working with somebody who needs bright lights, sometimes I'll ask if I can wear my hat, or my hat and sunglasses in some cases, and just say, hey, this is what I need to do so that I'm not interfering with your need for having brighter light, and also being able to tone down the bright lights that are in my eyes pretty much the whole shift. And so I think, if somebody comes and asks for a thing like that, or if you notice them taking those steps, just being as accepting as possible of it. The hearing challenges are somewhat unique, especially in a high-paced operations environment, because you need to be able to communicate back and forth. And so putting headphones on and having white noise piped in doesn't really work in that operation setting. So there are other things that folks may have to do to try to make those accommodations for themselves. But a lot of it is, from a leadership standpoint, is just being accepting of somebody needing that kind of accommodation, and being supportive of it.
Great, that was a great answer. I'm sorry I was a little rambly there. I was trying to figure out exactly how to ask what I need to know, but that's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. Those were my two questions, Kevin. I don't know if anybody else has any questions, but if you do, go ahead and ask them. I don't know if we have any other questions. I don't see any, it's not hands raised on Zoom, but I don't see anybody entering anything. So barring anybody talking or speaking up, just wanted to thank Kevin for giving this presentation. I think this is a topic that is being underserved in the meteorological community, and we need to talk about it more, and we need to provide the diversity in our workplaces. So this was great. I'm really happy that Kevin was able to present to us. And Kevin, did you have any closing statements or anything?
No, not really any closing statements. I'm going to see if I can bring up my title slide here again. And so anybody who may have a question after this, my email address is there. It's kevin.huyck@noaa.gov. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's some way that I can be helpful. And particularly if you have questions about any of this material. And I do have a list of sources attached to this presentation that's pretty long, and I'm happy to share those with anybody who's interested at a later time as well.
Well, and on behalf of the AMS Board of Operational Government Meteorologists, I just want to thank you again, Kevin, and thank you so much for presenting.